The bedroom door swung open. The billionaire froze. On his $50,000 bed, his black maid danced with raised hands, his 3 deaf sons jumping beside her, their faces alive with joy he'd never seen. In that moment, Richard Sterling realized the devastating truth. The woman he paid to clean his toilets was the only person who could talk to his sons. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Is she dead? Richard Sterling asked, his voice remaining as steady as if he were inquiring about the weather. The phone pressed against his ear felt suddenly heavy. Yes, Mr. Sterling. The accident happened last night. Vanessa's car went off the road during the rainstorm, his lawyer, Thomas Wilson, confirmed. Richard stood in his pristine home office, surrounded by awards and business magazines featuring his face on their covers. Through the large windows, the manicured grounds of his Greenwich, Connecticut mansion stretched out before him, perfectly maintained and utterly lifeless. I understand this is unexpected news, Thomas continued when Richard didn't respond. But there's something else you need to know. You've been named legal guardian of her children. Children? Richard finally showed emotion, his eyebrows lifting. What children? Her triplet sons. They're 5 years old, and they're deaf, Mr. Sterling. Richard placed his free hand on his mahogany desk to steady himself. That's impossible. Vanessa and I have been divorced for 3 years. She never mentioned children. According to my information, she gave birth 8 months after your divorce was finalized. The boys are Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles Carter, and you are listed as their legal guardian in her will. Richard ran his hand through his salt and pepper hair. There must be some mistake. I run a billion-dollar pharmaceutical company. I know nothing about children, especially deaf children. What about her family? Her mother is elderly and in poor health. There is no one else, Mr. Sterling. The paperwork is legally binding. After ending the call, Richard walked through his empty mansion. Each room was perfectly arranged. Expensive art hung on walls, furniture positioned just so, not a speck of dust anywhere. He had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals from nothing into a giant in the industry through hard work and ruthless determination. At 43 years old, he had everything he'd ever wanted. And now, 3 small deaf boys he'd never met were about to disrupt everything. 3 days later, Richard stood at his front door as a social worker's car pulled into his circular driveway. His lawyer stood beside him. "Remember what we discussed," Thomas said quietly. "The judge won't reconsider the guardianship unless there's clear evidence you cannot provide for them. Given your resources, that's unlikely." Richard straightened his tie. "How am I supposed to communicate with deaf children?" "I don't know sign language." "You can hire people who do," Thomas replied simply. The car stopped and a woman stepped out, Mrs. Ramirez according to the paperwork. She opened the rear door and 3 small boys climbed out. They stood close together on the driveway, clutching tiny backpacks, their dark brown eyes wide as they looked up at the enormous house. Richard felt something unexpected squeeze in his chest. They were so small, so vulnerable. Mrs. Ramirez approached with a professional smile. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Elena Ramirez from Child Protective Services. These are Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles." She pointed to each boy in turn, though Richard couldn't tell them apart. All 3 had the same dark brown skin, the same closely cropped black hair, the same wary expression. "Hello?" Richard said awkwardly, then realized his mistake. The boys were watching his mouth, but there was no recognition in their eyes. Mrs. Ramirez signed something to the boys, her hands moving quickly. One of the boys, Marcus, Richard thought, signed back, his small hands making sharp, seemingly angry movements. "What did he say?" Richard asked. "He asked where their grandmother is." "I explained that you're their guardian now," Mrs. Ramirez answered. "They're confused and frightened, Mr. Sterling. They've lost their mother and their home in 1 week." Richard nodded stiffly. "Please come in." He led them through his cavernous entrance hall with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. The boys stayed huddled together, their shoes making no sound on the polished surface. "I've prepared rooms for them," Richard said, leading the way upstairs to the east wing, the furthest from his own master suite. He'd had his assistant order beds, dressers, and basic clothes, all delivered and arranged yesterday. Mrs. Ramirez signed to the boys again, gesturing toward the 3 identical bedrooms Richard had prepared. The smallest boy, Miles, looked up at Richard with enormous eyes, then signed something. "He wants to know if they can stay together," Mrs. Ramirez translated. "They've always shared a room." "Oh." Richard hadn't considered that. "I suppose they can use one room for sleeping and the others for whatever else children do." Mrs. Ramirez gave him a look that made him feel incompetent, a sensation Richard Sterling hadn't experienced in decades. "Perhaps we should discuss their daily routine," she suggested. "The boys follow a schedule for meals, education, and bedtime. Structure is important, especially now." Richard checked his watch. "My assistant can take notes. I have a conference call in 15 minutes. Mrs. Ramirez's expression hardened. "Mr. Sterling, these children have just lost their mother. They need stability and connection more than anything right now." "I understand that," Richard said, though he didn't, not really. "But I'm not equipped to provide what they need. I'll hire someone who is." That evening, Richard interviewed 5 candidates sent by the most exclusive staffing agency in Connecticut. The final applicant was Maya Johnson, a 32-year-old black woman with a calm demeanor and direct gaze. "Your resume says you have experience with housekeeping, but nothing about childcare," Richard noted, sitting behind his desk while Maya sat opposite him. "I've worked with children throughout my career, though not as a nanny," Maya replied. "I was actually a teacher before budget cuts eliminated my position." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What did you teach?" "I specialized in education for deaf students," Maya said. "I have a master's degree in deaf education with a focus on early childhood development." For the first time that day, Richard felt a flicker of hope. "You know sign language?" "Yes. American Sign Language is my second language. I also know some Black American Sign Language, which might be what the boys use depending on their background." Richard leaned forward. "I need someone to live here and take care of 3 deaf boys. Their mother died, and I've become their guardian, but I know nothing about children or deaf culture. I need someone who can handle everything: their education, emotional needs, daily care. Money is no object." Maya studied him for a long moment. "May I meet the boys?" Richard led her to the dining room where the triplets sat at his massive table, looking tiny in the large chairs. Their dinner plates were mostly untouched. When they saw Maya, all 3 perked up slightly. Maya immediately signed to them, her hands moving fluidly. The boys' eyes widened, and all 3 began signing back rapidly, their small hands creating a conversation Richard couldn't begin to understand. "What are they saying?" he asked, feeling like an outsider in his own home. "They're telling me about their mother," Maya said quietly, "and asking when they can go home." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Tell them this is their home now." Maya signed this message more gently than Richard had spoken it. The boy Richard now recognized as Marcus signed something back forcefully. "He says this isn't home. It's too big and too quiet," Maya translated. Richard didn't know how to respond to that. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow," Maya said, still watching the boys. "But Mr. Sterling, they need more than a housekeeper. They need connection, especially now." "That's why I'm hiring you," Richard said, already checking his email on his phone. "You'll provide what they need. I'll provide the resources." As he walked away, Richard felt Maya's eyes on his back. He told himself he was doing the right thing. The boys would have everything they could possibly need: A beautiful home, the best education money could buy, and now a caretaker who could communicate with them. What more could anyone expect from him? After all, he'd never asked for this responsibility. He had a company to run, deals to make, a life that had no room for 3 small boys who couldn't even hear him speak. Yet as he climbed the stairs to his office, he found himself glancing back. Through the dining room doorway, he could see Maya sitting beside Miles, helping him with his food. The boy was actually smiling, the first smile Richard had seen from any of them. Richard turned away quickly. He had emails to answer and a company to run. Maya would handle the rest. Maya continued helping Miles with his dinner while Richard retreated to his office. The next 6 weeks established a pattern in the Sterling mansion, Richard existing in one world, the triplets in another. The following morning, Richard entered his kitchen at exactly 6 o'clock, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He found Maya at the counter preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Maya said, sliding a schedule paper across the counter. "I've created a daily routine for the boys. We'll start with breakfast at 7, then educational activities until lunch. Afternoons will include quiet time and outdoor play, dinner at 6, bath at 7:30, bedtime at 8. Richard glanced at the paper without really seeing it. "Looks fine, whatever you think is best." "The boys have been asking about you," Maya said. "They wonder why you're never around." Richard poured himself coffee. "I have meetings all day, I'll be home late. They need stability right now, someone they can count on." "That's why I hired you," Richard said, checking his watch. "I need to go." He walked past the stairs leading to the boys' rooms without looking up. Behind him, Maya sighed. At 7:30 that evening, Marcus stood at the window watching Richard's car pull into the driveway. His brothers were already in pajamas, playing quietly on the floor of their shared bedroom. "Look," Marcus signed to his brothers. "He's home." Malcolm and Miles joined him at the window. They watched Richard walk toward the house, phone pressed to his ear, face serious. "Maybe he'll say goodnight to us," Miles signed hopefully. Marcus shook his head. "He doesn't talk to us. He doesn't know how." When Richard entered the house, Maya met him in the hallway. The boys couldn't hear their conversation, but they could see through the banister railings. "The boys are still awake," Maya said. "They'd love to say goodnight." Richard loosened his tie. "I'm exhausted. I have reports to review before tomorrow." "Just 5 minutes," Maya pressed. "It would mean a lot to them." Richard sighed. "Fine." He followed Maya upstairs, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the boys' room. 3 pairs of eyes watched him cautiously. "Good night," Richard said, then remembered they couldn't hear him. He waved stiffly. Miles waved back enthusiastically. Malcolm offered a small smile. Marcus just stared. Richard nodded once, then turned and left. "See?" Marcus signed to his brothers once Richard was gone. "He doesn't want us here." The next morning, Richard rushed past the breakfast table where the triplets sat eating cereal. Miles tried to get his attention, waving a drawing, but Richard was looking at his phone. "I'll be in New York until 9 tonight," he told Maya on his way out. After he left, Marcus threw his spoon against the wall. Maya quickly moved to his side. "I know you're angry," she signed. "It's okay to feel that way." "I hate him," Marcus signed furiously. "I want to go home." "This is our home now," Maya signed gently. "No," Marcus signed. "Not with him. He doesn't want us." In the corner, Malcolm started drawing, his small hands working quickly, his paper filled with dark colors, black, blue, brown. When Maya looked over his shoulder, she saw he had drawn their old apartment building, with a woman standing outside, their mother. Miles slipped away from the table, heading for the large closet under the stairs. Maya found him there 10 minutes later, curled into a ball in the dark space. "Why are you hiding?" She signed when he looked up. "It's quiet here," Miles signed back. "Not too big." Maya sat beside him. "The house feels too big?" Miles nodded. "Everything is too big now, the house, the sadness, everything." Maya pulled him into a gentle hug. "I know, but we'll make it smaller together, okay? At Sterling Pharmaceuticals in New York City, Richard sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by board members. "The Johnson merger looks promising," Richard said, flipping through documents. "Their research division would complement our—" His phone vibrated. A text from Maya. "Malcolm having difficult morning. Keeps asking for his mother's scarf. Do you know where her personal items are?" Richard frowned, typing a quick response. "Check with lawyer. Focus on calming him down." "Richard?" A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Sarah Whitman, his chief operating officer, was watching him with narrowed eyes. Tall, blonde, and ruthlessly efficient, Sarah had been with the company for 8 years. "Sorry," Richard said, putting his phone away. "Where were we?" "The Johnson merger," Sarah said. "Perhaps we should reschedule if you're distracted." "I'm not distracted," Richard said firmly. "Continue." But as the meeting progressed, Richard checked his phone 4 more times. Sarah noticed each time, making notes in her leather portfolio. When the meeting ended, Sarah lingered behind. "Is everything all right, Richard?" she asked. "You seem preoccupied lately." "Everything's fine," Richard said, gathering his papers. "Just some household matters being sorted out." "The children," Sarah said. "It must be challenging, suddenly becoming a guardian to 3 young boys." "I've hired capable help," Richard said dismissively. Sarah nodded, her expression calculating. "Of course." "Still, if you need to adjust your schedule, the board would understand. We all want what's best for Sterling Pharmaceuticals." Her emphasis on the company name wasn't subtle. "The company remains my priority," Richard assured her. But that afternoon, during a call with potential investors, Richard found himself distracted again. Maya had texted that Miles was hiding in closets throughout the house, refusing to come out for lunch. On Friday morning, Richard canceled a weekend trip to check on their Boston office. "Why?" Sarah demanded over the phone. "Personal matters," Richard said vaguely. "These personal matters are becoming a pattern," Sarah said. "The board is starting to ask questions." After hanging up, Richard added a note to his assistant's task list. "Research schools for deaf children." That evening, he arrived home earlier than usual. The boys were in the living room with Maya, who was showing them simple signs. Richard stood in the doorway, watching. "Would you like to join us?" Maya asked, noticing him. "I have calls to make," Richard said, but he hesitated. "What are you teaching them?" "Family signs," Maya explained. "Mother, father, brother, grandmother." Richard nodded stiffly. "Carry on." He walked away, ignoring the weight in his chest. On Monday morning, Richard sat in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Westfield Elementary School. "Mr. Sterling? This is Principal Davis from Westfield. There's been an incident with Malcolm on his first day." Richard's stomach tightened. What kind of incident? "He became extremely distressed during class. He's having what appears to be a panic attack. We've tried calling Miss Johnson, but she's not answering." "She's at a doctor's appointment," Richard said, suddenly remembering. "What do you need me to do?" "We need someone to come get Malcolm right away. He's quite upset." Richard looked at his schedule. He had an important investor meeting in 2 hours. "I'll be there as soon as possible," he said, already dreading Sarah's reaction. At the school, Richard found Malcolm curled in a ball under a desk in the main office. A frustrated-looking teacher stood nearby. "He won't come out," she explained. "We don't have an interpreter today, so we couldn't explain what was happening." Richard knelt down, completely unsure what to do. Malcolm's small body was shaking with silent sobs. "Malcolm?" Richard said uselessly, knowing the boy couldn't hear him. He reached out tentatively, but Malcolm flinched away. "I've called Miss Johnson," the principal said. "She's on her way." Richard felt utterly helpless as he waited. When Maya finally rushed in 15 minutes later, the change was immediate. She knelt beside Malcolm, signing rapidly. The boy looked up, tears still streaming down his face. Maya signed something else, and Malcolm slowly crawled out from under the desk, straight into her arms. "What happened?" Richard asked. "The teacher tried to separate him from his brothers for different reading groups," Maya explained quietly while holding Malcolm. He panicked. They've never been apart in school before. The teacher couldn't explain what was happening because she doesn't know sign language. Richard watched Maya comfort Malcolm with gentle signs and reassuring touches. The contrast between her natural ability and his own incompetence was stark. "The investor meeting," Richard mumbled, checking his watch. "Go," Maya said, not hiding her disapproval. "I'll handle this." Richard hesitated, looking at Malcolm's tear-stained face. Something uncomfortable twisted in his stomach. "Tell Sarah I'll call in," he said finally. "I'll drive you both home." In the car, Richard watched through the rearview mirror as Maya signed stories to Malcolm in the back seat. The boy's breathing had calmed, though he still clutched Maya's hand tightly. Later that night, Richard stood in the hallway outside the boys' room. Maya was inside, teaching them bedtime signs. Her hands moved gracefully, and the boys mimicked her movements. There was a connection there that Richard couldn't comprehend, a language and understanding he didn't share. For the first time, he wondered if money and hired help weren't enough. The realization was uncomfortable, like a perfectly tailored suit suddenly feeling too tight. Richard turned away, retreating to his office, but even surrounded by familiar reports and spreadsheets, he couldn't shake the image of Malcolm curled beneath that desk, unreachable by the world around him, including Richard himself. Richard couldn't focus on his work that night. The image of Malcolm curled under the desk kept returning to his mind. After staring at the same report for 20 minutes, he closed his laptop and walked through the quiet house. Thursday afternoon arrived with an unexpected change to Richard's schedule. His 2 o'clock meeting with investors was canceled when their flight was delayed in Chicago. Richard found himself driving home early, a rare occurrence. The house seemed quiet when he entered, but as he climbed the stairs, he felt strange vibrations. Following the sensation, Richard realized it was coming from his own bedroom, a room no one else should be in. He pushed open the door and froze at the sight before him. Maya and all 3 boys were jumping on his $30,000 custom mattress. A small speaker sat on the bed, vibrating with music they couldn't hear but could clearly feel. Most shocking of all was the sound of laughter, real laughter, coming from the triplets. The boys were signing rapidly to each other, their hands flying in conversation while Maya signed back, her movements fluid and natural. None of them had noticed Richard yet. Miles was the first to spot him. His eyes widened, and he immediately stopped jumping. The others followed his gaze, and the laughter died instantly. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded. Maya quickly turned off the music. "Mr. Sterling, you're home early." "I can see that," Richard said coldly. "What are you doing in my bedroom?" "On my bed?" Maya helped the boys climb down. The boys were having a difficult day remembering their mother. They needed something positive, something they could feel instead of hear. The vibrations from music helped them connect with rhythm. "And my bedroom was the best place for this activity?" Maya stood straight, unintimidated. "Your mattress has the best vibration response in the house. I tested several locations." Richard noticed the boys hiding behind Maya now, watching his face carefully. "You were signing with them," Richard said. "Not basic signs, full conversations." Maya nodded. "Yes. You told me you knew sign language, but this is different. You're completely fluent, and they understand you perfectly." Maya took a deep breath. "Mr. Sterling, I think we should talk. Boys, go to your room for a little while, okay?" She signed as she spoke, and the boys nodded, filing past Richard with their heads down. When they were gone, Maya spoke. "I wasn't completely honest during my interview. I wasn't just a teacher who happened to know some sign language. I was a special education teacher specializing in deaf education for 8 years before budget cuts eliminated my position. Richard stared at her. You've been teaching them this whole time? Yes. For the past 6 weeks, while caring for them, I've been teaching them proper American Sign Language and helping them process their grief. Why didn't you tell me? Maya looked him directly in the eye. Because you didn't ask. You wanted someone to keep them out of your way. You weren't interested in communicating with them yourself. Richard felt his face grow warm with shame. That's not fair, isn't it? In 6 weeks, you've barely spoken to them. You leave before they wake up and come home after they're asleep. You hired me to be a barrier between you and them. Richard wanted to deny it, but couldn't find the words. Maya continued, her voice softening. Those boys are grieving their mother. They're living in a strange house with a guardian who doesn't know how to talk to them. I've been teaching them sign language not just for communication, but for emotional expression. They need that right now. Richard walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn. I don't know how to be what they need. No one is asking you to be perfect, Maya said, just present. Richard turned back to her. Show me. Show you what? Show me how to sign. Teach me what you've been teaching them. Maya's expression changed to surprise. You want to learn sign language? Yes, Richard said firmly. If they're going to live here, I need to communicate with them. Properly. Later that evening, Richard sat awkwardly at the kitchen table. Maya had cleared it, except for 2 cups of coffee. We'll start with basics, Maya said. Hello, goodbye, please, thank you. She demonstrated the sign for hello, her hand moving from her forehead outward in a small salute. Richard tried to copy her, but his fingers felt stiff and uncooperative. Relax your hand, Maya instructed. Signing is about fluid movement, not rigid positions. Richard tried again, feeling foolish. He had built a billion-dollar company, negotiated complex business deals, but couldn't make his hands form a simple greeting. This is harder than it looks, he admitted. It's a language, Maya replied. It takes time and practice. The boys have been learning since they were babies. They practiced for an hour. By the end, Richard could sign hello, goodbye, please, thank you, and his name. His movements were clumsy compared to Maya's graceful signs, but they were recognizable. Can I try with the boys? Richard asked. Maya nodded. They're in the playroom. But don't be discouraged if they don't respond immediately. Trust takes time. In the playroom, the triplets were building with blocks. They looked up when Richard entered, their expressions guarded. Hello? Richard signed carefully. Miles's eyes widened. He signed hello back immediately. Malcolm smiled slightly and also returned the greeting. Marcus just watched, his small face serious. My name is Richard. He signed slowly, following the pattern Maya had taught him. Miles moved closer, looking up at Richard with curiosity. He signed something Richard didn't understand. He's asking if you're going to learn more signs, Maya translated from the doorway. Richard nodded. Yes, he signed, using another new word. Miles smiled, a real, genuine smile, and Richard felt something shift inside him. The next morning, Richard made a call from his car. I need to reschedule today's 3 o'clock meeting, he told his assistant. The development team has been preparing for weeks, his assistant replied, surprised. I know. Move it to tomorrow morning. I have an appointment I can't miss. The appointment was his first formal ASL class at the Hartford Community Center. Richard sat uncomfortably in a circle with 7 other beginners, feeling out of place in his expensive suit among casually dressed people. The instructor, a deaf woman named Laura, welcomed everyone with expressive signs. An interpreter voiced her signs for the hearing students. Sign language is visual, spatial, and physical. Laura signed Talash, the interpreter spoke. Your facial expressions are as important as your hand movements. Richard, used to keeping his face carefully neutral in business settings, struggled with this concept. When Laura asked him to sign, I'm excited with appropriate facial expression, he felt ridiculous. More! Laura encouraged through the interpreter. Bigger expression! This is not a business meeting! By the end of the 2-hour class, Richard's hands were tired in a way they'd never been before. He had pages of notes and a homework assignment. Practiced 20 basic signs every day. Over the weekend, Richard made another change. He hired a company to install flashing light systems throughout the mansion. Lights that would flash when the doorbell rang, when a phone was ringing, or in case of fire alarms. These should be installed in every room, he instructed the technician, especially the boys' bedrooms and bathrooms. He also ordered visual alarm clocks and vibrating watches for each boy. Maya found him in his office researching more equipment. The boys noticed the installation team, she said. They asked if you ordered the flashing lights. Richard nodded. I should have done it sooner. They were impressed, Maya said with a small smile. Especially Marcus. He didn't say it, but I could tell. On Monday morning, Richard's phone rang during a meeting. Sarah Whitman raised an eyebrow as he checked the caller ID. Excuse me, I need to take this, Richard said, stepping out of the conference room. This is Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling, this is Mrs. Chen from Hartford Elementary. We're calling about Malcolm's art therapy session. Richard checked his watch. Is everything okay? Yes, but he's created something he's very proud of and wants to show you. The therapist feels it would be beneficial if you could come see it today. In the past, Richard would have immediately declined. Today, he hesitated. I'll be there at 2 o'clock, he said finally. When he returned to the meeting, Sarah was watching him closely. Family emergency? She asked. No, just rearranging my afternoon schedule. Sarah made a note in her portfolio. The Johnson merger paperwork needs your review by end of day. I'll complete it this evening, Richard assured her. At 2 o'clock, Richard walked into the elementary school art room. Malcolm's face lit up when he saw him, another first. The art therapist approached with a smile. Malcolm has been working on family portraits today. He wanted to show you his work. Malcolm proudly held up a colorful drawing. It showed 4 small figures and 1 tall one standing in front of a large house. Richard recognized the triplets, Maya and himself. This is very good, Richard signed carefully, using the phrases he'd practiced. Malcolm beamed and signed back quickly. He says he used blue for you because it's a calm color, the therapist translated. He thinks you need calm because you work too hard. Richard felt something catch in his throat. Thank you, he signed to Malcolm. That evening, Richard canceled his usual business dinner and returned home by 6 o'clock. The triplets were surprised to see him at the dinner table. I thought we could eat together, Richard said, signed awkwardly, using the few mealtime signs he'd learned. During dinner, he tried to ask each boy about their day, his hands forming the signs slowly. Miles responded enthusiastically. Malcolm showed him more drawings. Even Marcus, though still reserved, watched Richard's signing attempts with careful attention. Later, at bedtime, Richard stood in the doorway of the boys' room. Maya had just finished reading them a story through sign. Good night, Richard signed to each boy individually. Miles signed back immediately with a smile. Malcolm waved good night. Marcus just watched, but he didn't turn away. Progress of a sort. As Richard walked to his own bedroom, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. He stopped and practiced the sign for tomorrow, promising himself he would do better, learn more, be present. For the first time since the boys arrived, he was actually looking forward to seeing them in the morning. Morning came with a sense of purpose Richard hadn't felt in weeks. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs earlier than usual, arriving at the breakfast table before the boys. Maya looked up in surprise when he entered the kitchen. Good morning, Richard signed, speaking simultaneously. I want to practice. Maya smiled. They'll be down in 5 minutes. Remember the breakfast signs we worked on? Richard nodded, mentally reviewing the signs for cereal, juice, milk, and eat. When the triplets appeared in the doorway, all 3 paused at the unexpected sight of Richard at the table. Good morning, Richard signed carefully. Miles broke into a smile and hurried to the table, signing good morning back enthusiastically. Malcolm followed with a shy smile and a wave. Marcus came last, his expression cautious as he took his seat. "Cereal?" Richard signed, pointing to the boxes Maya had set out. "You mixed up cereal and orange," Miles signed, then demonstrated the correct hand position. Richard tried again, his fingers fumbling through the motion. Business presentations and complex negotiations had always come naturally to him, but these simple signs challenged him in unexpected ways. "Better," Miles signed with an encouraging nod. Throughout breakfast, Richard attempted basic conversation, asking what they wanted to do today. Miles responded eagerly, his hands moving so quickly Richard could barely follow. Maya translated the parts he missed. "He's excited about art class today." "They're making clay sculptures." Malcolm demonstrated how he would shape his clay, his small hands forming careful movements. Even Marcus watched Richard's signing attempts, occasionally nodding when Richard got a sign right. As Richard prepared to leave for work, he signed, "Have good day," his grammar incorrect but his intention clear. Miles and Malcolm signed goodbye. Marcus didn't respond, but he held Richard's gaze for a moment before looking away, a small improvement from complete avoidance. At Sterling Pharmaceuticals that afternoon, Richard sat at the head of the conference table as his team prepared for a presentation to potential investors from Japan. Sarah Whitman stood at the front of the room reviewing the final slides. "The research data on page 17 needs to be highlighted more prominently," Richard said, flipping through the presentation materials. Just then, his phone vibrated. A text from Maya appeared. "Malcolm feeling sick after lunch. Low fever. Don't worry yet. Just keeping you updated." Richard typed a quick reply. "Keep me posted. Call if fever goes up." "Richard," Sarah's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Did you hear my question about the market projections?" Sorry, could you repeat that?" Richard asked, setting his phone down. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "I asked if you wanted to present the 5-year growth strategy, or if you'd prefer I handle that section." "I'll present it," Richard said firmly. But during the actual presentation, an hour later, Richard checked his phone twice when the Japanese investors were reviewing documents. The third time, Sarah noticed and smoothly took over his explanation of research funding. "What Richard means to emphasize," she interjected, "is that our research division has secured consistent increases in funding despite market fluctuations." After the investors left, Sarah lingered in the conference room. "Is everything all right, Richard? You seem distracted." "Everything's fine," Richard said, gathering his papers. "Malcolm isn't feeling well." "Malcolm? One of the boys?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Of course. Well, I hope he feels better soon. In the meantime, I took the liberty of scheduling follow-up calls with Mr. Tanaka. I thought you might appreciate the flexibility in your schedule given your new responsibilities." Her tone made the words sound like an accusation rather than consideration. "Thank you," Richard said stiffly, "but in the future, please consult me before rearranging my calendar." 3 days later, Richard arrived home to find an unfamiliar luxury car in his driveway. Inside, he heard a woman's voice coming from the living room. "Really, Richard, you could have at least warned me." Dorothy Sterling sat perched on the edge of his sofa, her silver hair perfectly styled, her clothes expensive and immaculate. At 72, she still maintained the posture and presence that had made her a formidable figure in Boston society. "Mother," Richard said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "My annual visit, of course. The one we've had scheduled for months." Dorothy raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow, though apparently I should have called ahead to learn about my new grandchildren. Richard winced at her tone. "I'm sorry. Things have been hectic." "So I see." Dorothy gestured around the room, where evidence of the boys' presence was everywhere. Books, toys, and a set of flashcards with ASL vocabulary spread across the coffee table. At that moment, Maya entered with the triplets, who stopped abruptly at the sight of the stranger. "Boys, this is my mother, Dorothy," Richard signed and spoke. "Mother, these are Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles." Dorothy's eyes widened as she watched Richard sign. "You're learning sign language?" "Yes," Richard said simply. Dorothy pressed her lips together disapprovingly. "Well, how dedicated of you." The boys stayed close to Maya, watching Dorothy warily. "Why don't you three go upstairs while Mr. Sterling and his mother talk?" Maya suggested, signing as she spoke. After they left, Dorothy turned to Richard. "This is quite a change from when I visited last year. You've transformed your beautiful home into a nursery." "They need space to play and learn," Richard said defensively. "And what about your work?" "Sterling Pharmaceuticals has been your life's focus." "It still is. I'm managing both." Dorothy sipped her tea. "Are you sure that's the best arrangement? There are excellent boarding schools that specialize in children with special needs." "They're deaf, Mother, not incapable," Richard said sharply. "And they're staying with me." Dorothy looked surprised at his tone. "I'm only thinking of what's best for everyone involved. These children need specialized care, and you have a company to run." "I'm learning what they need," Richard insisted. "Maya has been helping me." "Ah, yes, the housekeeper." Dorothy's tone was dismissive. "How convenient." The following week, Richard sat across from Mrs. Winters, the boys' teacher at Westfield Elementary. Maya sat beside him, ready to interpret if needed. "The boys are struggling to adjust," Mrs. Winters explained. "Our resources for deaf students are limited. We have an interpreter only 3 days a week, and none of the other teachers know sign language." "What do you suggest?" Richard asked. "Frankly, Mr. Sterling, there are schools better equipped for deaf children. Westfield is doing our best, but the boys need more specialized support." On the drive home, Richard turned to Maya. "We need to look into deaf schools." "There's Bradford Academy for the Deaf in Hartford," Maya suggested, "and Riverside School in New Haven. Both have excellent programs." "Schedule visits to both," Richard decided, "as soon as possible." The following Saturday, Richard and Maya toured Bradford Academy. A deaf administrator showed them around with Maya interpreting. The classrooms had special lighting, visual learning tools, and teachers fluent in ASL. "All our staff are either deaf themselves or fluent in ASL," the administrator explained. "Students learn in their natural language while also developing English reading and writing skills." As they walked the grounds, Richard noticed Marcus watching him carefully. "What do you think?" Richard signed to him. Marcus didn't respond, turning away to look at the playground instead. Later, as they drove to the second school, Maya sighed. "Marcus is afraid." "Of what?" Richard asked. "He overheard your mother talking about sending them away to boarding school. He thinks if he starts to like you, you'll just send them away anyway." Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. "I would never do that." "He doesn't know that," Maya said gently. "His mother is gone. His home is gone. You're still a stranger to him." That evening, Dorothy joined them for dinner. Richard had set up the dining room with visual cards to help the boys request food items. Dorothy watched with thinly veiled disapproval as Richard signed with the boys, his movements becoming more fluid with practice. "Richard," Dorothy said during a lull in conversation, "I've been thinking about what we discussed. I have a friend on the board at Lakeside Academy. It's a wonderful residential school for deaf children. The boys would receive top-notch education and care." The triplets couldn't hear her words, but they were watching her lips and expressions. Marcus's face darkened, and he signed something quickly to his brothers. "What did he say?" Richard asked Maya quietly. "He told them, 'See? They want to send us away,'" Maya translated. Richard set down his fork. "Mother, the boys are staying with me. This is their home now." "But dear, be practical. This is clearly a charitable project for you, which is commendable, but—" "They are not a project," Richard interrupted, signing as he spoke so the boys could understand. They are family. My family. They stay here, with me. The simplicity and firmness of his statement hung in the air. Dorothy looked taken aback. The boys stared at Richard, surprised by his declaration. Miles signed family back to Richard, pointing to everyone at the table, including Maya. Yes, Richard signed, his hands forming the word with confidence. We are family now. Later that night, as Richard passed Marcus's room, he noticed the boy sitting alone by the window. Richard paused in the doorway. Can I come in? He signed. Marcus shrugged, which Richard had learned wasn't a no. Richard sat on the edge of the bed. I will not send you away, he signed carefully. Ever, I promise. Marcus studied Richard's face for a long moment. Then, slowly, his hands formed a sign Richard hadn't seen before. What does that mean? Richard asked. Marcus repeated the sign, then fingerspelled U-N-C-L-E. The word hit Richard with unexpected force. It was the first time any of the boys had acknowledged their relationship to him. Yes, Richard signed back, his throat tight with emotion. I am your uncle, and you are staying here with me. Marcus didn't smile, but he nodded once, a gesture of tentative acceptance that felt more significant than any business deal Richard had ever closed. In the days following Marcus's acknowledgement, Richard noticed subtle changes in how the triplets interacted with him. Miles had always been the most receptive, but now Malcolm began seeking Richard out to show him new drawings. Even Marcus, though still reserved, would occasionally make eye contact across the dinner table and respond to Richard's signing attempts. 5 months into his guardianship, Richard sat in his home office practicing medical terms in sign language with Maya. His hands had become more fluid with daily practice, though he still struggled with complex concepts. The boys have checkups next week, Maya explained. The doctor knows some basic signs, but it helps if you understand medical vocabulary. Richard carefully formed the sign for fever when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Sarah Whitman, he told Maya. I need to take this. Richard, Sarah said when he answered, the board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. The Japanese investors are pushing for a decision on the merger. That wasn't scheduled until next month, Richard said. Things have accelerated. They're sending their team today. We need to finalize terms. I'll be there in an hour, Richard promised. He had just ended the call when Maya's phone rang. Her expression turned concerned as she listened. It's Miles's teacher, Maya said, covering the phone. He's not feeling well. She says he's very warm and lethargic. Richard checked his watch, thinking about the board meeting. Can you pick him up? My car's in the shop today. I was going to ask if I could borrow yours later. Richard hesitated only briefly. Tell her I'll come get him myself. At Westfield Elementary, Richard found Miles in the nurse's office, curled on a small cot. His normally bright eyes looked dull, and his brown skin had an ashen undertone. When he saw Richard, Miles lifted his hands weakly to sign. My head hurts, he signed slowly. Richard felt Miles's forehead. It was burning hot. I'm taking him to the doctor now, Richard told the nurse. This fever is too high. On the drive to the hospital, Richard kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Miles, who had fallen into a restless sleep in his booster seat. Richard's phone vibrated repeatedly with messages from Sarah and board members, but he ignored them. At Hartford Memorial Hospital's emergency room, Richard carried Miles inside. A nurse approached immediately. His fever is very high, Richard explained. He's 5 years old and deaf. We'll need to check his temperature and vital signs, the nurse said, leading them to an examination room. Miles woke up as the nurse took his temperature. His eyes widened in fear at the unfamiliar surroundings. Where, Maya? Miles signed frantically. She's coming later. Richard signed back. I'm here with you. The nurse watched their exchange. Do you need an interpreter? Yes, Richard said. Is one available? The nurse frowned. Our ASL interpreter is only here until 3 o'clock on Thursdays. She left an hour ago. Miles signed something Richard didn't catch. What did he say? Richard asked. I don't know sign language, the nurse admitted. Richard realized with sudden clarity that he was Miles's only connection to what was happening. The responsibility felt enormous. I know some sign, Richard told the nurse. I can interpret, but I'm still learning. When the doctor arrived, he explained that Miles needed blood tests and possibly a spinal tap to rule out meningitis. I need to explain the procedures to him, the doctor said. Can you translate? Richard felt a wave of anxiety. His sign vocabulary was limited, and these were complex medical concepts. But looking at Miles's frightened face, he knew he had to try. Miles, Richard signed carefully, the doctor needs to take blood from your arm to check why you're sick. Miles's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded bravely. Will it hurt? Miles signed. Richard turned to the doctor. He wants to know if it will hurt. Tell him he'll feel a pinch, but we'll use special cream to make it hurt less, the doctor explained. Richard translated this information as best he could, his hands forming each sign with careful precision. When he didn't know a specific medical term, he finger-spelled it or found simpler ways to explain. Throughout the blood draw, Miles gripped Richard's hand tightly. Richard signed encouragement with his free hand, never breaking eye contact with his nephew. The doctor returned an hour later with results. Good news, it's not meningitis. He has a severe ear infection that's causing the high fever. We'll start antibiotics now, but I'd like to keep him overnight for observation. Richard nodded, then carefully signed this information to Miles. Miles's shoulders sagged with relief, though his eyes still showed fear at the prospect of staying overnight. Will you stay with me? Miles signed. Without hesitation, Richard signed back, Yes, all night. I won't leave. Richard's phone vibrated again. Sarah had called 6 times. He stepped into the hallway briefly to text her. Family emergency. Cannot attend meeting. Proceed without me if necessary. Her response came immediately. Board is waiting. Investors are here. Your absence sends a concerning message. Richard turned off his phone and returned to Miles's side. Throughout the evening, nurses came and went. Richard interpreted everything for Miles, his signing improving with each conversation. When Miles finally fell asleep, Richard sat in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of his small chest. Around midnight, Maya arrived, having taken a taxi to the hospital. How is he? She whispered. Fever's starting to come down, Richard said quietly. They want to keep him until tomorrow afternoon. Maya studied Richard's exhausted face. You look tired. I can stay now if you want to go home. Richard shook his head. I promised I'd stay all night. Maya's eyes widened slightly. What about the board meeting? I missed it, Richard said simply. Richard, that merger can wait, he finished. Miles couldn't wait. Maya smiled. You interpreted for him all day? I tried. There were many signs I didn't know. I had to fingerspell a lot. But you did it, Maya said. 5 months ago, you wouldn't have known how to say hello to him. Miles stirred in his sleep, his small hand reaching out. Richard gently took it, and Miles settled again. Go home, Maya, Richard said softly. The other boys need you. I've got this. The next morning, a nurse brought breakfast for Miles just as he was waking up. His fever had broken overnight, and his eyes looked clearer. Feeling better? Richard signed. Miles nodded, then signed, You stayed. I promised I would. Richard signed back. After breakfast, Richard turned his phone back on. It immediately buzzed with multiple notifications. Most were from Sarah, but one email made his stomach tighten. A legal notice from someone named Evelyn Carter. Richard opened it while Miles watched cartoons on the hospital TV. The message was brief, but clear. Evelyn Carter, Vanessa's mother and the boys' maternal grandmother had filed for custody, claiming Richard was incapable of providing a culturally appropriate environment for black deaf children. As Richard stared at the screen, another call from Sarah came through. This time he answered. "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded. "The board proceeded with the merger vote without you." "How did it go?" Richard asked, his voice low to avoid disturbing Miles. "They approved it with the terms the Japanese team wanted, including restructuring the research division." Richard closed his eyes briefly. The research division had been his priority to protect in the negotiations. "I see," he said. "Richard, this absence has raised serious concerns about your commitment to Sterling Pharmaceuticals," Sarah continued. "Several board members have suggested we discuss leadership structure at the next meeting." "I understand," Richard said. "We'll talk when I'm back in the office." After ending the call, Richard looked over at Miles, who was watching him curiously. "Work problems?" Miles signed. Richard smiled slightly. "Yes, but not important right now." Later that afternoon, the doctor discharged Miles with a prescription for antibiotics. Richard carried him out to the car where Maya waited with Marcus and Malcolm. When Miles saw his brothers, he immediately began signing rapidly, telling them about his hospital adventure. Richard watched their hands fly in conversation and realized with surprise that he understood most of what they were saying without Maya's translation. "Miles says you stayed all night," Maya noted, watching Richard's face. "I did," Richard confirmed. "And the merger meeting?" "I missed it." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "There's something else, isn't there?" Richard hesitated, then pulled out his phone to show her the email from Evelyn Carter. Maya's eyes widened as she read, "She's filing for custody? But she barely saw the boys when Vanessa was alive. She claims I can't provide a culturally appropriate environment," Richard said quietly. The boys had stopped signing and were watching the adults' conversation. "What's wrong?" Marcus signed, his expression suspicious. Richard looked at the three small faces watching him. Something inside him hardened with resolve. "Nothing for you to worry about," he signed, his movements clear and confident. "I know about your grandmother. She wants to see you. But we will face this together." Maya looked surprised at Richard's fluent signing. The boys exchanged glances, clearly understanding him without translation. "Together?" Miles signed back, pointing to all of them. "Yes," Richard signed firmly. "Together." That night, after tucking all three boys into bed, even Marcus allowing Richard to pull his blanket up, Richard sat in his office reviewing the custody filing. The company merger had proceeded without him, potentially costing him his CEO position. But as he looked at photos of the triplets on his desk, Richard realized with perfect clarity that while losing his company would hurt, losing these boys was simply not an option. Richard woke early the next morning with a clear plan forming in his mind. For the first time in his career, Sterling Pharmaceuticals would not be his only priority. He called his assistant before she even arrived at the office. "Janet, I need you to make some changes to my schedule and workspace," Richard said. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Janet replied, sounding surprised at the early call. "What changes do you need?" "First, have the IT team set up advanced video conferencing in my home office today, the best system available." "For meetings from home?" Janet asked. "Yes, I'll be working from here at least 2 days a week now," Richard explained. "Also, find me the best ASL instructor in the city for private lessons. For you." "For me?" Janet's voice rose in surprise. "Yes. I need you to learn basic sign language to communicate with the boys. It's important for my home and work life to connect better." After ending the call, Richard found Maya in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the boys. "I need your help with 2 things," Richard said. "First, I want to convert the formal dining room into a proper space for signing and learning. Better lighting, comfortable seating, visual tools, whatever the boys need." Maya raised her eyebrows. "That's a big change. Your mother always said that dining room was a Sterling family heirloom. The boys are Sterling family now, Richard said firmly. The second thing, I want to learn about Black Deaf culture. Books, community events, anything that would help me understand their heritage better. Maya nodded slowly. There's a Black Deaf Community Center in Hartford. They host family events on weekends, and I can recommend some books and online resources. Good. I want the boys to stay connected to their culture. It's part of who they are. Later that morning, Richard walked into Sterling Pharmaceuticals for the first time since missing the merger vote. Employees stared as he passed, clearly having heard about the board meeting. Sarah was waiting in his office. The board wants to see you, she said without greeting. They're concerned about your level of commitment. Richard nodded. I'll meet with them. But first, I'm making some changes. He pressed the intercom. Janet, could you come in, please? Janet entered with a notebook. Yes, Mr. Sterling? Please inform Maid that I'll be working from home on Tuesdays and Thursdays. All meetings on those days will be conducted via video conference. Also, I'm blocking off 3 to 6 every evening. No meetings, no calls. Sarah's eyes widened. Richard, the Carson presentation is scheduled for Thursday, and they specifically requested an in-person meeting. Reschedule it for Wednesday, or I'll handle it by video, Richard said calmly. My schedule is changing to accommodate my family responsibilities. After Sarah left, Richard spent the morning calling key clients personally, explaining his new arrangement. Most were surprisingly understanding. By afternoon, the first whispers about Richard's changed priorities had spread throughout the company. The following Tuesday, Richard sat in his newly equipped home office, video conferencing with his executive team. The meeting was nearly finished when Miles wandered into the frame, not realizing Richard was on a call. Excuse me one moment, Richard said to his team. He turned to Miles and signed, I'm in a meeting. Is everything okay? Miles nodded and signed back. Maya said dinner in 20 minutes. Thank you, Richard signed. I'll be done soon. Richard turned back to the screen to find his team watching with surprise. Instead of appearing embarrassed, Richard smiled. That was Miles. He's letting me know dinner is in 20 minutes, so let's wrap this up. After the call ended, Richard found an email from Sarah. Board members expressing increased concern about your focus. Quarterly numbers down 4% since merger. On Thursday, Richard made a bold decision. He brought all 3 boys to Sterling Pharmaceuticals for the afternoon. He'd prepared the staff in advance, sending a company-wide email explaining that his nephews would be visiting. Richard gave the triplets a tour of the offices, signing as they walked. Employees watched with a mixture of curiosity and surprise as their normally stern CEO patiently signed with 3 small boys. In the main conference room, Richard had set up a table with coloring books and snacks for the boys while he conducted a brief meeting with department heads. As you can see, Richard said to his team, I'm introducing my nephews to Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles are deaf, which is why I've been learning sign language. During a break, Janet approached the boys with a smile. She carefully signed, Hello, nice to meet you, I'm Janet. Miles high-fived her enthusiastically, while Malcolm shyly waved back. Even Marcus looked impressed. Later, as they prepared to leave, Sarah approached Richard. Bringing children to the office is highly unusual, she said quietly. They're my family, Richard replied, and Sterling Pharmaceuticals is a part of me. It's important they understand both worlds. The following weekend, Richard and Maya took the boys to the Hartford Deaf Community Center. The event was specifically for Black deaf families with activities for children and resources for parents. As they entered, many people stared at Richard, the only white person in the room. A woman approached them, signing rapidly. What's she saying? Richard asked Maya. She's asking why you're here, Maya translated. Richard took a deep breath and signed slowly but clearly. These are my nephews. I am their guardian. I want to learn about their culture and community. The woman's expression remained skeptical, but she nodded and directed them to the children's activity area. Throughout the afternoon, Richard sat uncomfortably on the sidelines, watching the boys interact with other deaf children. A man in his 50s eventually sat beside him. "First time here?" the man signed, with Maya interpreting. Richard nodded. "Yes, I'm new to all of this. I'm David. My daughter is deaf," the man signed. "It's not easy for hearing parents, even harder for white guardians of black deaf children." "I'm learning," Richard signed carefully. "That's more than some do," David responded. "Keep coming back. It gets easier." At home, Richard worked with contractors to transform the formal dining room. The heavy curtains were replaced with light-filtering blinds. The antique chandelier gave way to specialized lighting that eliminated shadows. The formal dining table was exchanged for a round table better suited for signing visibility. Marcus helped Richard arrange the new space, suggesting where the best lighting should be. "You understand this better than I do," Richard signed to him. Marcus shrugged but continued helping, occasionally correcting Richard's furniture placement. On Tuesday morning, Richard sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the custody case against Evelyn Carter. "She has strong arguments," his lawyer, Thomas, explained. "Courts often favor blood relatives, especially grandmothers. Her claim that you can't provide cultural connections has merit." "What are our counter-arguments?" Richard asked. "Your resources, stability, and the fact that Vanessa specifically named you guardian. But Richard, I have to be honest. A wealthy white businessman with no childcare experience against a black grandmother who shares their cultural background, it's an uphill battle." Richard leaned forward. "I'm not just a businessman anymore. I've learned sign language. I'm connecting with the deaf community. I'm learning about their cultural heritage." "That's good, but Evelyn will argue these are recent surface-level efforts." "Then we'll need to show the depth of my commitment," Richard said firmly. That evening, the triplets helped Richard set up their first family meal in the new signing space. The round table allowed everyone to see each other clearly, and the lighting was perfect for visual communication. "This is our special place for talking," Richard signed to the boys. "Everyone can see everyone here." Miles beamed with excitement, signing, "Family dinner." Malcolm had drawn place cards for everyone, including Maya, who joined them at Richard's insistence. "You're part of this family now," Richard told her. "The boys need you at the table." Even Marcus seemed pleased with the new arrangement, carefully arranging his silverware just so. They had just started eating when the doorbell rang, accompanied by flashing lights throughout the house. Maya went to answer and returned with a troubled expression. "It's Evelyn Carter," she said quietly to Richard. Richard nodded. "Show her in." Evelyn Carter was a tall, dignified woman in her early 60s. She stepped into the dining room and froze at the sight before her. Richard and 3 boys sitting at a round table, clearly in the middle of signing conversation. "Mrs. Carter," Richard said, standing. Then, simultaneously signing and speaking, he added, "Please join us for dinner. Boys, this is your grandmother." The triplets stared at Evelyn with wide eyes. She looked from them to Richard, clearly surprised to see him signing. "I didn't expect this," Evelyn said, gesturing to the signing space. "We were just talking about school," Richard signed and spoke. "Miles had an art project today." Miles immediately began signing about his drawing, his hands moving enthusiastically. Richard interpreted for Evelyn, who watched with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "You know sign language," she said to Richard. "I'm learning," Richard replied, signing simultaneously. "I practice every day." Marcus signed something quickly to Richard. "Marcus wants to know if you sign," Richard translated for Evelyn. Evelyn looked uncomfortable. "No, I never learned. Vanessa said she would teach me, but then—" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time Richard saw grief in her eyes that matched what he'd seen in the boys. "Please, sit with us." Richard signed and spoke. "There's plenty of food." The boys should know their grandmother. Evelyn hesitated, then slowly took the empty chair beside Malcolm. The boy immediately showed her his drawing, pointing to the figures that represented his family. As dinner continued, Richard noticed Evelyn watching him interact with the triplets. Her expression gradually shifted from suspicion to thoughtful observation as she saw the easy way the boys communicated with him through sign. When Miles spilled his juice, Richard immediately signed, "It's okay," and helped clean up without a hint of annoyance. When Malcolm wanted more pasta, he signed his request to Richard, who served him with a smile. Even Marcus, still the most reserved, engaged in brief signed exchanges with Richard throughout the meal. By dessert, Evelyn's rigid posture had relaxed slightly. When she finally spoke again, her voice was less confrontational. "You've made a lot of changes for them," she observed. Richard nodded, signing as he spoke for the boys' benefit. They needed a home that works for them, not one they had to adapt to. Evelyn watched him sign, then looked at each of the boys in turn. Vanessa would be surprised. "I was surprised myself," Richard admitted, still signing, "but they've changed me for the better." As Richard walked Evelyn to the door after dinner, she paused. "This doesn't change the custody situation," she said firmly. "Those boys need their culture, their heritage." "I agree," Richard replied. "That's why I'm learning about it, connecting with the community. The boys need their grandmother in their lives, but they also need stability and the home they're beginning to trust." Evelyn studied his face. "We'll let the judge decide," she said, but her tone held less certainty than before. After she left, Richard returned to find Maya helping the boys clear the table. "What did she say?" Maya asked quietly. "She's still pursuing custody," Richard replied, "but I think tonight was important. She saw we're not just strangers living in the same house, we're becoming a family." Maya nodded, watching as Miles carefully carried his plate to the kitchen, proud of his responsibility. "You know," she said, "6 months ago you wouldn't have recognized that look on his face, pride in helping. You wouldn't have known what his raised eyebrows meant, or how to tell when Marcus is actually interested versus just tolerating something." Richard watched the boys, realizing Maya was right. He had learned to read not just their signs, but their expressions, their body language, the subtle ways they communicated beyond formal signing. "We're not just learning their language," Richard said. "They're teaching us theirs." The following evening, Richard and Maya sat in his home office surrounded by papers. The custody hearing was approaching, and they were reviewing documents from both their lawyer and Vanessa's estate. "There's so much to organize," Maya said, sorting through another stack of papers. "Medical records, school documents, Vanessa's will." Richard rubbed his tired eyes. "Thomas says we need everything in order before the hearing next week." Maya opened a large envelope that had just arrived from Vanessa's attorney. "These are the last of her personal effects. Legal documents, insurance papers, and some personal items for the boys." As Maya emptied the envelope, a sealed letter fell onto the desk. It was addressed simply, "Richard." "What's this?" Richard picked up the envelope, noting Vanessa's handwriting. "It looks personal," Maya said. "Do you want me to leave?" Richard shook his head. "No, stay. We're in this together." He opened the letter carefully and began reading. His expression changed from curiosity to shock. The color drained from his face. "Richard?" "What is it?" Maya asked, concerned. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he handed her the letter. "Read it." Maya took the letter and read aloud. "Richard, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you've become guardian to my sons. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago. The boy's father wasn't a man I met after our divorce, as I led everyone to believe. Their father was Daniel, your brother. We had a brief relationship during the time you and I were separated, before our divorce was finalized. He never knew I was pregnant. When the accident took his life, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I was angry at you, at the world, and I wanted something that was just mine. But the boys deserve to know their family. That's why I named you as guardian. They are your nephews by blood, not just by law. They are Sterlings, I'm sorry for keeping this from you." Vanessa Maya looked up, her eyes wide. "Daniel was their father? Your brother?" Richard stood and walked to the window, his back to Maya. "Daniel died 7 years ago in a car accident. We weren't close at the end. I was too busy building the company." His voice trailed off. Maya set the letter down gently. "The boys are your biological nephews." "Yes," Richard said quietly. "That explains why Vanessa chose me as guardian. Not because she had no other options, but because I'm their uncle, their blood relative." "Does this change how you feel about them?" Maya asked cautiously. Richard turned around. "It changes everything and nothing. They're still the same boys they were yesterday. But now I understand why I felt such a strong connection, especially recently. They're part of Daniel." Maya glanced at the letter again. "Will you tell them?" "Yes, but carefully. They're only 5. They'll need time to process this." Richard's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Sarah Whitman's name flashed on the screen. "Richard," Sarah said when he answered, "the board has scheduled a vote of no confidence for next Thursday. They're questioning your leadership in light of your continued absences and the declining quarterly numbers." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "The same day as the custody hearing." "What?" Sarah asked. "Nothing. I'll address the board's concerns," Richard said firmly. After ending the call, Richard turned to Maya. "Sarah and the board have scheduled a vote to potentially remove me as CEO. It's on the same day as the custody hearing." Maya looked alarmed. "What will you do?" "I need to call my mother," Richard said, ignoring her question. "She should know about Daniel's children before anyone else." Dorothy Sterling arrived at Richard's house the following afternoon. Her normally perfect composure was shaken as she entered the living room where Richard waited. "Is it true?" she asked without greeting. "Daniel was their father?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I found a letter from Vanessa yesterday." Dorothy sat down slowly. "All this time I've had grandchildren I didn't know about." "I was as surprised as you are," Richard said. "Where are they now?" Dorothy asked. "Upstairs with Maya. I wanted to talk to you first before telling them." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. The first time Richard had seen his mother cry since Daniel's funeral. Daniel's children. My grandchildren. And I suggested sending them to boarding school. Richard reached out awkwardly to pat her hand. "You didn't know." "Have you told them yet?" Dorothy asked, wiping her eyes discreetly. "Not yet. I'm trying to figure out how to explain it simply. They're only 5. Dorothy straightened her shoulders, regaining some of her composure. "I have something that might help. In my car, Daniel's photo albums and some of his things from childhood. I brought them when you called." An hour later, Richard sat with the triplets in their signing space. Maya was present to help with any complex signs Richard might struggle with. Dorothy waited in the living room, giving Richard space to talk to the boys first. Richard placed a photograph of Daniel on the table. "Do you know who this is?" he signed. The boys shook their heads. "This is my brother," Richard signed. "His name was Daniel." Miles leaned forward, studying the picture. "He looks like you," he signed. "Yes," Richard agreed. "We were brothers." Marcus watched Richard's face carefully. "Where is he now?" He signed. "He died," Richard signed simply. "A long time ago, before you were born." Malcolm touched the photograph gently. "Was he deaf like us?" He signed. "No," Richard signed. "He could hear." Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "I have something important to tell you. Daniel was your father." The boys looked confused. Miles signed. "Our father?" "Yes," Richard signed. "Your mother and Daniel loved each other. He was your father, which makes me your uncle. Not just your guardian, but your real uncle." Marcus's expression changed from confusion to something deeper. He stood up suddenly and walked away from the table, going to stand by the window. Malcolm looked back and forth between the photograph and Richard. "We look like him?" He signed. "Yes," Richard signed. "You have his smile." And Marcus has his strong jaw. Miles signed excitedly. "So you are our real family? Not just because papers say so?" "Yes," Richard signed, his throat tight with emotion. "We are real family. Blood family." Miles smiled widely, but Malcolm looked over at Marcus with concern. Richard followed his gaze. "Marcus," Richard signed, moving to stand near him. "Are you okay?" Marcus didn't respond, his back still turned. When he finally turned around, his eyes were full of confusion and hurt. "Why didn't Mom tell us?" He signed. "I don't know," Richard signed honestly. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. She should have told us both." Marcus looked at the photograph again. "Did he know about us?" "No," Richard signed. "He died before he knew your mom was going to have you." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. Then he signed something that broke Richard's heart. "Did he want us?" Richard knelt down to be at eye level with Marcus. "He would have loved you very much. Daniel always wanted children." After a moment, Richard signed, "There's someone else who wants to meet you as Daniel's children. Your grandmother, my mother, is here. She has pictures of Daniel when he was young." Dorothy sat nervously on the sofa as the boys entered the living room with Richard. She had composed herself, but her hands shook slightly as she held a photo album. "Boys," Richard signed, "this is your grandmother. She is my mother and Daniel's mother." Dorothy smiled tentatively. "Hello," she said, awkwardly forming the sign Richard had taught her. Miles immediately sat beside her, curious about the album. Malcolm approached more slowly while Marcus hung back, watching. Dorothy opened the album. "These are pictures of your father when he was your age," she explained as Richard interpreted. The first photograph showed Daniel at about 6 years old, holding a baseball mitt too big for his hand. His smile was wide and carefree. "He loved baseball," Dorothy said, her voice soft with memory. "He collected baseball cards and comic books." As they turned the pages, the boys leaned in closer. There were photos of Daniel growing up, playing sports, at birthday parties, at the beach with Richard. "Look," Maya said suddenly, pointing to a photo of teenage Daniel. "Malcolm has his exact eyebrows." Everyone looked between the photo and Malcolm. It was true. The shape was identical. "And Miles has his ears," Dorothy added, noticing another similarity. Marcus finally moved closer, looking at the pictures intently. Dorothy turned to a photo of Daniel as a young man, serious-faced in a graduation gown. "Marcus looks just like him here," Dorothy said. The same expression. Marcus studied the photo for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he climbed onto the sofa next to Dorothy and pointed to another picture, asking with his hands for more information. Dorothy looked at Richard helplessly, not understanding the sign. "He wants to know what Daniel was like," Richard interpreted. Dorothy smiled at Marcus. He was brave and kind. He stood up for people who needed help. He loved art and music and baseball. As Richard signed her words, Dorothy's eyes filled with tears again. "And he would have loved you boys so much." Later that night, after the boys were in bed, Richard, Maya, and Dorothy sat in the kitchen. "They're so much like him," Dorothy said. "How did I not see it before?" "None of us knew to look," Richard replied. "What will you do about the board vote?" Maya asked. "It's the same day as the custody hearing." Richard looked at the calendar on his phone. "I can't be in 2 places at once. The custody hearing has to come first." "You could lose the company," Dorothy said, alarmed. Richard nodded. "I know, but I won't lose Daniel's children, not now that I've found them." Dorothy reached across the table and took her son's hand, a rare gesture of affection. "Daniel would be proud of you, Richard. For the first time, I think he truly would be." As Richard headed to bed that night, he stopped to check on the boys. All 3 were sleeping peacefully. On Malcolm's nightstand, He had placed the photograph of Daniel. Richard touched it gently, then looked at his nephews, his brother's sons. "I'll take care of them, Daniel," he whispered. "I promise." The custody hearing was now just a week away, with the board vote scheduled for the exact same time. Richard knew he couldn't fight on both fronts simultaneously. For the first time in his life, Sterling Pharmaceuticals would have to come second. The morning of the custody hearing arrived with gray skies and light rain. Richard stood in front of his closet, considering his options. For important business meetings, he always wore his navy power suit. Today, he chose a softer gray one instead. Maya helped the boys dress in their best clothes, small button-up shirts and neat pants. Richard signed encouragement as he fixed Miles's collar. "Everything will be okay," he signed. "Just be yourselves." Thomas Wilson, Richard's attorney, arrived early. "We need to review our strategy one more time," he said. "And I've been trying to reach you about the board meeting." "Have you spoken with Sarah?" "I sent a formal request to reschedule," Richard replied. "They refused." Thomas frowned. "So they're proceeding with the vote of no confidence while you're in court. That's outrageous." Richard nodded. "Sarah made sure of it." "You could send me to represent you at the custody hearing," Thomas suggested. "Then you could attend the board meeting." Richard shook his head firmly. "No, the boys need me at the hearing. Sterling Pharmaceuticals will have to manage without me today." Dorothy arrived next, dressed elegantly in a blue suit. "The car service is ready," she said. "Maya, will you ride with me and the boys? Richard can go with Thomas to review the case." As they prepared to leave, Richard's phone rang. It was Sarah. "Richard, this is your final opportunity," Sarah said without greeting. "The board is assembling now for a preliminary discussion. If you're not here in 30 minutes, they'll take that as confirmation of your disinterest in the company's future." Richard watched the boys putting on their small coats, Maya signing instructions to them. "I won't be there, Sarah. I have a family commitment that cannot be rescheduled." "This is career suicide," Sarah warned. "Everything you've built." "I'll deal with the consequences tomorrow," Richard interrupted. "Goodbye, Sarah." He ended the call and turned to his family. "Let's go." The Hartford County Courthouse was busy that Thursday morning. Richard and his group were directed to Courtroom C, where several people already waited, including Evelyn Carter and her attorney. Evelyn wore a formal dress and looked nervous. When she saw the boys, her expression softened. She waved to them, and Miles waved back. The other two stayed close to Richard. Judge Michael Bennett entered, and everyone stood. He was an older man with gray hair and glasses who moved deliberately as he took his seat. "Custody case number 8459, Carter versus Sterling," he announced. "This is a petition by Evelyn Carter for custody of minors Marcus Malcolm and Miles Carter. Are both parties present?" Both attorneys confirmed they were ready. "Miss Taylor, as the petitioner's counsel, you may begin," the judge instructed. Evelyn's attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, approached the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, my client is seeking custody of her 3 grandsons, who are currently living with Richard Sterling following the death of their mother, Vanessa Carter. While Mr. Sterling was named guardian in Ms. Carter's will, we contend this arrangement is not in the children's best interest." She proceeded to outline their case, explaining that the boys needed cultural connections Richard couldn't provide. These children are black and deaf, 2 important identities that shape their experience of the world. They need a guardian who understands these experiences firsthand, who can guide them through the challenges they will face. The attorney presented evidence of Richard's early neglect, including testimony from the boy's first school about his absence at meetings and events. She showed Richard's work schedule, highlighting his 60-hour work weeks and frequent business trips. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling has no experience raising children, while Mrs. Carter is an experienced mother and grandmother who shares the boy's cultural background. Richard sat straight-backed through the presentation, occasionally signing brief reassurances to the triplets, who were watching the proceedings with wide eyes. When it was Thomas's turn to present Richard's case, Richard leaned over and whispered something to him. Thomas looked surprised, then concerned. They had a brief, whispered conversation before Thomas reluctantly nodded. "Your Honor," Thomas said, standing. "Mr. Sterling would like to address the court directly." The judge raised his eyebrows but nodded. "Very well." Richard stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. Instead of standing behind the podium, he moved to an open space where the boys could clearly see him. "Your Honor," Richard began, "with your permission, I'd like to sign as I speak so the boys can understand my testimony directly." "Granted," the judge said, looking curious. Richard began speaking, his hands moving in perfect sync with his words. "5 months ago, I knew nothing about raising children, especially deaf children. When Vanessa died and named me guardian of her sons, I was completely unprepared. I made many mistakes in those early weeks. I kept my distance. I hired help instead of getting involved. I continued prioritizing my company over 3 boys who had just lost their mother." Richard's signing was fluid now, his months of practice evident in his smooth movements. But then something changed. I realized these boys needed more than a roof over their heads and money for their education. They needed connection, communication, understanding. Richard turned slightly to include both the judge and the boys in his signing space. "I learned American Sign Language. I transformed my home to be deaf accessible. I connected with the deaf community to understand their culture and needs. I'm still learning every day, but my commitment is absolute." Richard then revealed the discovery about Daniel. "Recently, I learned something that explains why Vanessa chose me as guardian. The boy's father was my brother, Daniel Sterling, who died before they were born. Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles are not just my wards. They are my nephews by blood." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Evelyn's attorney looked startled by this revelation. "This doesn't change the fact that I am still learning to be the guardian they deserve. But it does explain the connection I've felt with them from the beginning, a connection that has grown stronger every day." Richard then detailed the changes he'd made in his life and home, the visual alarm systems, the signing space, his schedule adjustments, the ASL classes, the connections with the Black deaf community. "I now attend every school event. I know their favorite foods, their fears, their dreams. Miles loves science and is fascinated by how things work. Malcolm expresses his emotions through art. He's created over 50 drawings that now hang throughout our home. Marcus is a natural leader who protects his brothers fiercely." Richard signed directly to the boys now. "You 3 have changed my life in ways I never imagined. You've taught me that success isn't measured by business deals or money, but by the connections we make and the love we share." Turning back to the judge, Richard concluded, "I'm not perfect, Your Honor. I'm still learning. But I love these boys, and I will do everything in my power to give them the life they deserve, one that honors both their mother's memory and their father's legacy." After Richard's testimony, Dorothy took the stand, her voice emotional as she spoke about seeing her late son in the boys. "When I look at Marcus, I see Daniel's determination. When Malcolm smiles, it's Daniel's smile. When Miles gets curious about how something works, it's exactly how Daniel was at that age." The judge called a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Richard's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Janet. "Board vote complete. Sarah is now CEO." "I'm so sorry, Richard." Maya noticed his expression as he read the message. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I've been removed as CEO," Richard said simply. "Oh, Richard," Maya squeezed his arm. "I'm so sorry." Richard looked at the boys who were sitting nearby with Dorothy. "It's just a job," he said. "This is what matters now." When court resumed, Judge Bennett looked thoughtfully at both parties. "This is not a simple case," he began. "Both Mr. Sterling and Mrs. Carter clearly care deeply for these children. After reviewing all evidence and considering what's in the best interest of the minors, I've reached my decision." The courtroom grew silent. Richard reached for Maya's hand without thinking. "I'm granting primary physical custody to Richard Sterling with substantial visitation rights for Evelyn Carter." Richard exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "Mrs. Carter will have the children every other weekend and one evening per week, plus shared holidays. Both parties will participate in decisions regarding the children's education, medical care, and cultural activities." The judge continued, "Mr. Sterling has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to these children, learning their language and adapting his life to meet their needs. The blood relationship through their father further supports this arrangement." Judge Bennett looked directly at Richard. "However, Mrs. Carter provides an essential connection to their maternal heritage and culture. These boys will benefit from having both of you in their lives." As the judge finalized the details, Richard signed the results to the boys. Miles immediately jumped up and ran to Richard, throwing his arms around him. Malcolm followed quickly. Even Marcus, after a moment's hesitation, joined the embrace. "We stay with you?" Marcus signed, his hands between their bodies. "Yes," Richard signed back. "You stay with me, and you'll visit Grandma Evelyn, too." As Richard held the boys, he looked across the courtroom at Evelyn. Her disappointment was evident, but when their eyes met, she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. They would need to find a way forward together, for the boys' sake. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, having heard about the Sterling Pharmaceuticals CEO's custody battle. Cameras flashed as Richard emerged with the triplets. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you've been removed as CEO?" one reporter called out. Richard placed a protective hand on Miles's shoulder. "Today isn't about Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Today is about family." He guided the boys toward the car where Dorothy and Maya waited. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Richard looked at the three small faces watching him. His brother's sons, his nephews, now officially his children in every way that mattered. The company he'd built from nothing was no longer his. The career he'd devoted his life to had changed irrevocably. Yet sitting in that car, surrounded by family, Richard Sterling felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. The peaceful feeling stayed with Richard for the drive home, but reality set in the next morning. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, which displayed dozens of emails about Sterling Pharmaceuticals. News of his removal as CEO had made the business headlines. Sterling out, board cites family distractions as pharmaceutical giant changes leadership. His phone had been ringing constantly. Calls from board members, business associates, journalists, and lawyers eager to help him fight this injustice. Richard had ignored them all. Maya knocked softly on his office door. "The boys are asking about breakfast. They want to know if you're joining them." Richard closed his laptop. "Yes, of course." In the kitchen, the triplets were already seated at the table. They fell silent when Richard entered, watching him carefully. "Good morning," Richard signed with a smile that felt more natural each day. "Are you sad?" Miles signed bluntly. Richard paused, considering how to answer. The boys deserved honesty. "A little," he signed. "I lost my job yesterday." "Because of us?" Malcolm signed, his expression worried. "No," Richard signed firmly. "Because I made a choice, and I would make the same choice again." Marcus studied Richard's face. "What will you do now?" He signed. It was a question Richard had been asking himself all night. Looking at the three boys watching him expectantly, the answer suddenly became clear. Something new, Richard signed. Something important. Later that morning, Richard called his financial advisor. "Nathan, I need you to set up a new entity, a nonprofit foundation." "Interesting timing," Nathan replied. "I've had 6 calls already about your situation at Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Several law firms want to represent you in a wrongful termination suit." "I'm not interested in suing," Richard said firmly. "I want to create something new, the Sterling Foundation for Deaf Education." "A foundation?" Nathan sounded surprised. "What exactly would it do?" Support deaf children and their families. Fund interpreter training programs, technology research, scholarships, especially for underserved communities. Nathan was silent for a moment. This is quite a change of direction, Richard. I know. Can you set a meeting with the necessary experts for tomorrow? After ending the call, Richard found Maya in the living room folding laundry. I need to talk to you about something important, he said, sitting across from her. Maya set aside the clothes. Is this about Sterling Pharmaceuticals? No, it's about the future. Richard leaned forward. I'm starting a foundation focused on deaf education and resources. I want you to be the education director. Maya's eyes widened. Me? You have the expertise, the passion, and the vision. You've been teaching me and the boys for months. Now you could help thousands of deaf children. But what about the boys? Maya asked. They need me here. You'd still be part of their lives, Richard assured her. The foundation would be based here in Connecticut, and they'd be proud to see you using your teaching skills again. Maya looked thoughtful. I never expected this opportunity when I answered your job posting. Neither did I, Richard admitted, but here we are. The following week, Richard attended his first board meeting at Sterling Pharmaceuticals since being removed as CEO. Whispers followed him through the halls as he walked toward the boardroom. Sarah Whitman was already seated at the head of the table where Richard had sat for 15 years. She looked momentarily startled when he entered. "Richard," she said, recovering quickly, "we weren't sure you'd attend." "I'm still a major shareholder and board member," Richard replied calmly, taking a seat. The other board members filed in, many avoiding his eyes. Thomas Reynolds, the chairman, called the meeting to order with obvious discomfort. "Before we begin, I want to address the elephant in the room," Richard said. "I accept the board's decision to remove me as CEO. I won't be challenging it legally." Visible relief spread around the table. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. "However," Richard continued, "I have a proposal I'd like the board to consider." He distributed folders to each member. "This is an overview of the Sterling Foundation for Deaf Education, which I'm establishing. I'm requesting Sterling Pharmaceuticals become a founding corporate sponsor." Sarah frowned. "This seems rather presumptuous, Richard." "Not at all," Richard replied. "It's good business. Sterling Pharmaceuticals has always supported educational initiatives. This would strengthen our community presence and create positive publicity during this leadership transition." Several board members nodded, looking through the materials. "The foundation will focus on underserved deaf children, providing resources, technology, and educational support," Richard explained. "I've already committed $20 million of my personal funds." By the end of the meeting, the board had approved a $5 million corporate sponsorship for the foundation. As everyone filed out, Sarah approached Richard. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" Richard asked. "Lawyers. Threats. The Richard Sterling I knew would have fought ruthlessly to regain control." Richard smiled slightly. "The Richard Sterling you knew didn't have 3 boys waiting for him at home." 2 weeks later, Richard and Maya met with Evelyn at a small coffee shop to discuss visitation schedules. The initial awkwardness gradually eased as they focused on what the boys needed. "Malcolm mentioned he has an art show next Friday," Evelyn said. "I'd like to attend." "Of course," Richard agreed. "It starts at 6 o'clock. He'd love to have you there." "And Miles has been talking about a science project," Evelyn continued. "Something about vibrations and sound?" "Yes, he's creating a device that converts sound to vibrations for deaf people to feel music," Richard explained. "He's very excited about it." "That's wonderful," Evelyn said, genuine pride in her voice. "And Marcus? How is his adjustment going?" "He signed up for basketball," Richard said. "The coach knows some sign language, and Maya and I take turns interpreting during practices." "I noticed you've become quite fluent in sign," Evelyn observed. "I practice every day," Richard said, "and I've started learning Black American Sign Language to honor their cultural heritage." Evelyn looked surprised. You have? Yes. A community center in Hartford offers classes. You'd be welcome to join me. Evelyn considered this. Perhaps I will. It would be good to communicate with them directly. When they parted, the tension between them had noticeably decreased. On Saturday morning, Richard watched from the sidelines as Marcus practiced with his basketball team. The coach had gathered the children in a circle and was demonstrating a new passing technique. Richard signed the instructions as the coach spoke. Marcus caught on quickly, his natural athleticism making the new skill look easy. When he successfully completed a drill, he looked over at Richard for approval. Richard gave him a thumbs up, pride swelling in his chest. After practice, as they walked to the car, Marcus signed, "Did you see my basket?" "Yes," Richard signed back enthusiastically. "It was perfect." "Coach says I'm getting better," Marcus signed, his expression more open than Richard had ever seen it. "You are," Richard agreed. "You work very hard." At home, they found Maya and Malcolm setting up an art display in the living room. Malcolm had created several paintings for his upcoming school exhibition. "Look!" Malcolm signed excitedly when they entered. "Miss Garcia chose my paintings for the main wall at school." Richard examined each painting carefully, signing specific praise for the colors, composition, and creativity. Malcolm beamed under the attention. In the kitchen, Miles was deep in concentration, working on his science project. Components of a speaker were spread across the table as he carefully modified them. "How's the project going?" Richard signed. "Almost done." Miles signed back. "When music plays, this part vibrates differently for bass and treble." "Impressive," Richard signed. "You figured that out yourself?" Miles nodded proudly. "I tested many ways. This works best." Richard marveled at how each boy was developing his unique talents and interests. The frightened, silent children who had arrived at his door 6 months ago were blossoming into confident individuals. The following Thursday, Richard hosted an open house to officially launch the Sterling Foundation for Deaf Education. The event was held at his home, which had been transformed for the occasion. Educational displays filled the living room, and interpreters were stationed throughout to ensure communication access for all guests. Maya stood beside Richard as he welcomed community members, educators, and potential donors. She had accepted the position as education director and already had numerous programs in development. "Richard Sterling?" Richard turned to find Sarah Whitman standing behind him. She looked out of place among the diverse crowd of deaf and hearing guests. "Sarah," Richard said, surprised, "I didn't expect you here." "I wanted to see this foundation for myself," she said, glancing around. "It's impressive." "Thank you," Richard replied. "Maya deserves most of the credit for the educational programming." Sarah nodded politely to Maya. "The board was right about one thing. Your focus had shifted, but perhaps not in the way we thought." Before Richard could respond, Miles ran up to him, tugging on his sleeve. "Uncle Richard," Miles signed excitedly, "the newspaper lady wants to take our picture for the story." "I'll be right there," Richard signed back. Sarah watched this exchange with curiosity. "You're really fluent now," she observed. "Getting there," Richard said. "If you'll excuse me, apparently we're wanted for a photo." Richard joined the boys near the foundation's new banner. A photographer from the Hartford Courier positioned them together, with Maya standing beside them. "One more with just Mr. Sterling and the boys," the photographer requested. As Richard stood with his arms around the triplets, he caught sight of Dorothy and Evelyn chatting together near the refreshment table. They had found common ground in their shared love for the boys, despite their very different backgrounds. The photographer snapped the photo. Richard, standing tall with Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles, gathered close to him, all four smiling naturally. Later, as the event wound down, Richard found himself standing in his backyard, taking a moment of quiet. Maya joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Successful launch," she said. offering him a cup. "Thanks to you," Richard replied. "Are you happy with your decision to join the foundation?" Maya nodded. "It feels right. Using my teaching background to help other deaf children while still being part of the boys' lives." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you answered my job posting?" Richard asked. Maya laughed. "A wealthy CEO learning sign language and starting a deaf education foundation? Definitely not." "Sometimes I hardly recognize my life," Richard admitted. 6 months ago, success meant quarterly profits and market share. Now it means seeing Miles figure out his science project," Maya finished, "or watching Malcolm's face when someone appreciates his art, or Marcus finally letting you coach him on his basketball technique." Richard nodded. "Exactly." Inside, they could see the boys showing their grandmother how to sign simple phrases. The house that had once felt like a museum was now undeniably a home, filled with children's artwork, educational games, and evidence of 3 distinct personalities growing and thriving. "We should head back in," Richard said. "I want to thank everyone for coming." As they walked toward the house, Richard realized that rebuilding his life hadn't meant replacing what he'd lost. It had meant creating something entirely new, something he wouldn't trade for all the corporate success in the world. 2 years passed, bringing changes that transformed both Richard's home and heart. The Sterling mansion, once a showcase of wealth and status, had become a lively family home filled with evidence of 3 growing boys. On a bright Saturday morning in June, Richard stood in his kitchen watching Malcolm carefully arrange fruit on a platter. At 8 years old, Malcolm's artistic talent had only grown stronger. Even a simple task like preparing food became an opportunity for creativity. "The red strawberries should go next to the yellow pineapple," Malcolm signed, his movements confident and precise. More visual contrast. "It looks beautiful," Richard signed back, his own signing now completely fluent after 2 years of daily practice. Miles rushed into the kitchen holding a small electronic device he'd built himself. "I fixed it!" he signed excitedly. "The vibration pattern changes with different instruments now." "That's amazing," Richard signed, examining the device. "Will you demonstrate it at the fundraiser tonight?" Miles nodded enthusiastically. "I made a whole presentation. Maya helped me practice." Marcus appeared in the doorway next, his hair damp from the shower. "Dad, where's my blue shirt?" "The nice one?" he signed. Richard still felt a wave of emotion whenever any of the boys called him Dad, a title they had begun using 6 months earlier, on their own initiative. It had started with Miles, then Malcolm, and finally Marcus, who had been the most hesitant but ultimately the most committed once he made the decision. "Maya ironed it. It's hanging in your closet," Richard signed. Marcus gave a quick thumbs up and disappeared back upstairs. Maya entered from the garden carrying fresh flowers. "The tent is all set up outside," she said, and signed simultaneously, a habit they all practiced to keep communication inclusive. The caterers arrive at 4 o'clock. The annual Sterling Foundation fundraiser had become the most important event in their calendar. Now in its 2nd year, the foundation had grown beyond anything Richard had initially imagined. They had established interpreter training programs in 3 states, funded research for new communication technologies, and created scholarships for deaf students pursuing higher education. Maya had thrived as the education director, her expertise and passion driving many of the foundation's most successful initiatives. Her relationship with Richard had evolved too, from employee to partner in every sense, professional, parental, and personal. They had begun dating a year ago, their shared commitment to the boys providing the foundation for something deeper. "Is everything ready for your speech?" Maya asked Richard. "I think so," Richard signed. "I'm more nervous about this than any corporate presentation I ever gave." Maya smiled. "That's because this matters more." By 6 o'clock that evening, the Sterling property was filled with guests. The spacious backyard housed a large tent with tables, a stage, and displays highlighting the foundation's work. Flashing lights were integrated throughout the space, signaling when presentations were about to begin. Dorothy arrived early, her signing skills now competent enough for basic conversation with her grandsons. She greeted each boy with signed phrases she had practiced specially. "Malcolm, your artwork is wonderful," she signed, admiring the display of his paintings that decorated one wall of the tent. Malcolm beamed. "Thank you, Grandma." "I made that one for you," he signed, pointing to a vibrant landscape. Evelyn Carter arrived next, bringing homemade cookies the boys loved. Over the past 2 years, she and Richard had developed a respectful co-parenting relationship. The boys spent every other weekend with her, and she attended all their important school events. "Miles, show your Grandma Evelyn your science project," Richard encouraged. Miles eagerly demonstrated his device that translated music into patterns of vibration, explaining the technology in rapid sign language. Evelyn watched with obvious pride, her own signing improving steadily through the classes she took with Richard. As more guests arrived, Richard watched Marcus confidently giving tours to donors, explaining the Foundation's work, with Maya occasionally interpreting for hearing guests who didn't know sign language. "Richard Sterling, this is quite an impressive event." Richard turned to find Sarah Whitman standing behind him. Her presence was unexpected. They had maintained a cordial but distant relationship since the board vote 2 years earlier. "Sarah," Richard greeted her, "I'm glad you could come." Sarah glanced around at the diverse crowd of deaf and hearing people communicating through a mix of sign language, speech, and interpreters. "Sterling Pharmaceuticals made a donation," she said, handing him an envelope. "The board voted unanimously to increase our support this year." "Thank you," Richard said. "That's very generous." Sarah hesitated, then added, "You've created something remarkable here. Something I didn't anticipate when we—" She trailed off. "When you replaced me as CEO?" Richard finished with a small smile. It worked out for the best. Before Sarah could respond, the lights flashed, signaling the beginning of the program. Richard excused himself to join his family on stage. The triplets sat in the front row as Richard took the podium. Maya stood beside him, ready to voice interpret his signing for hearing guests who didn't know ASL. "Welcome to the 2nd annual Sterling Foundation fundraiser," Richard began, signing and speaking simultaneously, a skill he had mastered through countless hours of practice. "2 years ago, I was a very different person. I measured success by stock prices and market share. I lived in this house alone, surrounded by expensive things but no real connections." Richard paused, looking at the 3 boys watching him from the front row. "Then 3 deaf boys came into my life unexpectedly. At first, I saw them as an obligation, a responsibility I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't communicate with them. I didn't understand their needs. I tried to maintain my old life while keeping them at a distance." His hands moved fluidly as he continued, "But these boys, Marcus, Malcolm, and Miles, wouldn't let me remain disconnected. They taught me that real communication isn't just about words or signs, but about presence, attention, and love." Richard described the Foundation's achievements over the past year: interpreter training programs that had graduated 50 new interpreters, technology grants that had developed new communication tools, educational resources that had reached thousands of deaf children nationwide. None of this would exist without 3 boys who pushed me to learn their language, to see the world through their eyes, to understand that family isn't defined by blood alone, though in our case it turned out that it was. The audience laughed softly at this reference to the discovery of the boys' connection to Richard's brother. Today, Marcus is not just an excellent basketball player, but a mentor to younger deaf children learning the sport. Malcolm's artwork has been featured in student exhibitions across the state. Miles is developing technologies that bridge deaf and hearing worlds in new ways. Richard's face grew more serious. But their greatest achievement isn't what they do, it's who they are. 3 brave boys who faced loss and change with resilience and hope, who taught a stubborn businessman that the measure of success isn't what you own, but who you become and how you touch other lives. After his speech, a video played showing the impact of the foundation's work across the country. The screen displayed deaf students who had received scholarships, teachers learning sign language, and families benefiting from the foundation's resources. When the formal program ended, guests mingled and explored the displays. Richard found himself surrounded by people wanting to discuss the foundation's work, but his eyes kept returning to the boys. Marcus explaining basketball signs to a curious donor, Malcolm showing his art techniques to a group of children, Miles demonstrating his vibration device to impressed adults. Gradually, the guests departed. As the last cars pulled away, Richard, Maya, and the boys gathered in the living room, still dressed in their formal clothes but with ties loosened and shoes kicked off. "That was our best fundraiser yet," Maya signed, settling onto the couch beside Richard. "We raised enough for the new interpreter program in Chicago," Richard agreed. Miles yawned widely. "Can we have hot chocolate before bed?" He signed. "Good idea," Richard signed back. "I'll make it." In the kitchen, Richard prepared hot chocolate while the boys changed into pajamas. When they returned, they all settled in the living room, the formal space now dotted with comfortable pillows and family photos. "Tell us a story about our dad," Malcolm requested, a frequent bedtime appeal. Richard smiled and began signing a story about Daniel as a child, how he had once built a backyard fort and insisted on sleeping in it despite a thunderstorm. "He was brave like you, Marcus," Richard signed. "Creative like you, Malcolm, and curious about how things worked, just like you, Miles." The boys watched intently, occasionally asking questions about the father they'd never known. Maya joined in, adding her observations about traits the boys shared with Daniel based on stories and photographs. "I wish he could see you now," Richard signed. "He would be so proud of who you're becoming." "But you tell him about us, right?" Miles signed sleepily. "Yes," Richard signed. "Every day." As the boys grew tired, Richard and Maya helped them to bed. Each room now reflected its occupant's personality. Marcus's filled with sports equipment and trophies, Malcolm's with art supplies and colorful creations, Miles's with books and half-built inventions. After the boys were asleep, Richard and Maya stood in the hallway looking at the family photos that lined the walls, a visual history of their journey together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Maya asked, gesturing to the home they had created. Richard shook his head. "Never. I had everything I thought I wanted before they came. I had no idea what I was missing." Maya slipped her hand into his. "What about now? Do you have everything you want?" Richard looked at the rooms where his sons slept, at the woman beside him, at the home filled with love and communication that had once been just an empty showcase. "Yes," he signed, the movement as natural to him now as breathing. Everything and more. In the quiet house, with flashing lights instead of sound-based alarms, with sign language books on the shelves and children's artwork on the refrigerator, Richard Sterling had found a success no business achievement could match. The success of a family built through commitment, communication, and love. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.